She took a limping mason as husband, not knowing he signed the taxes she paid. The thought was a phantom, an impossible future irony that hung unseen in the flour-dusted air of the bakery. For now, there was only the ache in Alara's shoulders, the burn in her wrists as she kneaded the stubborn dough. Each push and fold was a prayer, a protest against the crushing weight of the crown's latest levy. Outside, a miserable autumn rain wept against the window panes, mirroring the quiet despair that had settled over their village. The decrees came from the capital, but they were enforced by the reclusive, unseen Duke of Stonehaven, a man spoken of in whispers as being as cold and unyielding as the granite of his castle. His taxes were a blight, slowly starving the very people he was meant to protect. Alara's father, his cough a constant, rasping rhythm from the other room, had already sold 2 of their fields. The bakery, their last bastion, was next. She was kneading away their future. It was in this atmosphere of damp desperation that the village matchmaker arrived, her shawl smelling of wet wool and grim purpose. The proposal she carried was as strange as it was stark. A husband for Alara. A newcomer to the village, a mason named Alec, sought a wife. He was a quiet man, scarred by the wars and left with a permanent limp. But his hands were skilled, and he had secured a lucrative private commission rebuilding a section of the old abbey. He offered a shocking sum, enough to clear her family's debts entirely. In return, he asked only for a wife to make a home. He wanted peace, not passion. Partner, not a prize. Desperation was a harsh suitor, and it had already won Alara's hand. She agreed. She took a limping mason as husband, not knowing he signed the taxes she paid. Their marriage was a transaction witnessed by a weary priest and the whispering rain. Their new home, a cottage at the edge of the woods, was small but immaculately built, the stones fitted with a precision that spoke of a master's hand. Alec, her husband, moved through the space with a stilted quietness that Alara found unnerving. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than she'd expected, and when his gray eyes rested on her, she felt not like a wife, but like a problem he was trying to solve. For Lord Alistair Vance, the Duke of Stonehaven, that was precisely what she was. This entire charade, the calloused hands he'd earned through weeks of grueling, unfamiliar labor, the carefully constructed identity of Alec, the limp that was his only truth, was an act of penance and investigation. From his cold fortress, he had signed ledgers and approved taxes, abstract figures on a page. He had been told the levies were fair, necessary. But whispers of unrest had reached him, and a deep, gnawing cynicism born on a battlefield had prompted him to see the truth for himself. He had meant only to observe. But then he had seen her, Alara, her face pale with worry as she sold loaves for half their worth to a mother with hungry children, and his detached experiment had fractured. He had invented the commission, arranged the matchmaker, and bought his way into her life, a spy in his own kingdom. The first test of his new reality came a week later. A pair of the Duke's own guards, puffed up with petty authority, clattered into the village square. They were collecting a special tithe, a tax so new and punitive that Alara knew it would break the remaining families. They swaggered toward the bakery, their eyes lingering on her with casual insolence. "The Duke requires his due," the captain sneered. Before Alara could answer, Alec moved between them. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. "Sergeant Rorick," he said, his tone flat and cold. "Your patrol route is the North Road. You have no jurisdiction here." The sergeant, a bull of a man, froze. His eyes narrowed, searching Alec's face for a glimmer of recognition. "And who are you to know my routes, Mason?" Alec took a slight step forward, his limp more pronounced. "I know a man who exceeds his orders when I see one. I know the penalty for it, too. Now leave, before your commander hears of this." There was something in his stillness, an echo of absolute command that brooked no argument. It was the posture of an officer, not a laborer. The guards exchanged a confused glance. Then, with a sullen shrug, they turned and left. Alara stared at her husband, her heart thudding. The air around him still crackled with an authority that did not belong in their small cottage. "How did you do that?" she whispered. "The war," he said, his gaze distant. You learn how to speak to men like that. He turned away, leaving her with more questions than answers. The cracks in his story began to widen. A fortnight later, her father's cough worsened, settling deep in his chest until his breaths were shallow, painful rasps. The village apothecary wrung his hands, offering only willow bark and prayers. Alara sat by his bedside, watching the life flicker in him, her own hope turning to ash. Alec watched her, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a torment she couldn't comprehend. That evening he simply said, "I will be back," and disappeared into the rainy darkness. The journey to the nearest town with a proper physician was 6 hours by fast horse, an impossible trek for a man with a lame leg. Yet, just before dawn, he returned. He was soaked to the bone, mud caked on his boots, but in his satchel were glass vials of a potent, dark tincture and herbs she had never seen before, their scent sharp and foreign. "A friend," he said, cutting off her questions before she could ask them. "I knew a surgeon in the army. He worked at the hearth, grinding the herbs with a mortar and pestle, his movements efficient and sure. He measured the dosage with a concentration that was absolute." As she watched him by the flickering firelight, the rough-spun image of Alec the mason dissolved, replaced by a man of unnerving competence and profound mystery. He was tending to her father not with the fumbling care of a workman, but with the quiet confidence of one accustomed to giving life-saving orders. A strange, frightening tenderness bloomed in her chest. It was more than gratitude. It was the dawning recognition of the man hidden inside the disguise. Her father's fever broke, and with it, the suffocating tension in the cottage began to ease. A fragile domesticity took root in the spaces between their silences. Alara would bake, and the warm, yeasty scent of bread would fill their home, a scent Alec confessed he had never known in his own childhood. He spent his days building a long stone wall along the edge of their small property. The rhythmic chink-chink-chink of his hammer and chisel became the new sound of her life, a sound of creation, of permanence. They started to talk. He asked her about the different types of flour, the science of yeast, and listened with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time, truly heard. In return, he spoke of stone. He explained the stresses and forces, the way a keystone could bear the weight of an arch, the history held within a piece of granite. He spoke with the soul of a scholar, the vocabulary of an architect. This was not the talk of a village mason. Alistair, in turn, found himself being unmade. The rigid armor of the Duke, forged in grief and duty, was being dismantled piece by this woman's quiet dignity. He saw the calluses on her hands and felt a profound shame for the softness of his own. He heard the villagers greet her with genuine affection and realized no one had looked at him that way in his entire life. He was living a lie, yet for the first time he was touching something true. The weight of the deception grew heavier each day, a poison in the well of his burgeoning love for her. The past intruded in the form of a sleek black carriage that rolled into the village, utterly alien against the backdrop of wattle and daub homes. A man in severe, black livery disembarked, Finch, the Duke's steward. His eyes scanned the village with disdain until they landed on Alec, hammering a stone into place on the wall. Finch's face went white with shock. Alistair saw him and his blood ran cold. He met the steward behind the cottage, out of Alara's earshot. "Your Grace," Finch hissed, his voice a frantic whisper. "This is madness. The entire duchy believes you are in seclusion, grieving. What is the meaning of this farce?" "I am conducting an inquiry," Alistair said, his voice hard. "An inquiry? Dressed as a common laborer? Living in a hovel with a baker's girl?" The contempt in Finch's voice was a razor. "You will return to the castle at once. This ends now." "It ends when I say it ends," Alistair retorted, his ducal authority rising like an instinct. "You will leave and you will not speak of this to anyone." Alara, drawn by the heated, urgent voices, had crept to the corner of the cottage. She heard only fragments. "Your Grace," "deception," "the estate." The words made no sense, yet they sent a chill of premonition down her spine. The argument ended abruptly. Alistair strode back around the cottage, his face a thunderous mask. He saw her standing there, her expression clouded with confusion and suspicion. The truth clawed at his throat, desperate for release. He could tell her, end the lie and face the consequences. But fear, cold and sharp, stayed his tongue. What would he be without the lie? Just the monster who had been ruining her life. Instead of speaking, he acted. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to cup her face. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was an act of desperation, a frantic attempt to erase the last 5 minutes, to silence the questions in her eyes with a raw, undeniable passion. It was a confession of everything he couldn't say, a brand of his feelings on her lips, and it was the most profound lie he had yet told. The kiss was a cataclysm. It shattered the polite fiction of their arrangement and laid bare the turbulent emotions beneath. The careful distance they had maintained collapsed, and in the quiet, firelit nights, they became husband and wife in truth. He learned the map of her body, she the rhythm of his heart. In the darkness, he was not the Duke and she was not his subject. They were simply a man and a woman, finding solace in one another's arms. He began to share pieces of his real self, truths couched in the context of his lie. He told her of the battle that had shattered his leg, the suffocating guilt of surviving when so many of his men had not. He spoke of the cold, lonely childhood in a vast, empty house after his parents died. He was giving her his wounds, his grief, the realest parts of him, while withholding the one thing that defined him, his name. She, in turn, accepted these confessions with a grace that humbled him. She would trace the puckered scar that ran the length of his thigh, her touch not one of pity but of quiet understanding. She was healing a wound far deeper than the one in his flesh. One evening, curled against him by the hearth, the scent of cooling embers filling the air, she gave him her own confession. "I am so afraid," she murmured into his chest. "The new notices will be posted soon. I fear this is the one that will finally take the bakery from Papa," she sighed, a sound of bone-deep weariness. "I often wonder about the Duke. I imagine him sitting in his grand castle, counting his gold, never once thinking of the lives he ruins with a flick of his pen. What kind of man must he be?" Alistair went rigid in her arms. Each word was a perfectly aimed arrow striking his heart. He held her tighter, the woman he loved, as she unknowingly condemned him, and the irony was so exquisite it was a physical pain. He was the faceless monster in her nightmares and the man she held for comfort. The day the new decree was posted, the village square felt like a funeral. The tax was worse than anyone had imagined, a final, brutal blow. There was talk of rebellion, but it was the hopeless, angry talk of beaten people. Alara would not be beaten. She was determined to fight, to find some flaw, some loophole in the Duke's cruel document. She secured a copy from the Reeve, the thick parchment crackling with official menace. She carried it back to the cottage, their sanctuary, and spread it across the small wooden table where they took their meals. Alec was outside, putting the last stone on the wall he had built for her, for them. He had decided today he would tell her everything. He would abdicate his title if he had to. He would do anything but lose her. Alara's eyes scanned the dense, unforgiving script. Her finger traced the lines of legalese, her mind racing. Then it reached the bottom of the page. There, beside a smear of wax bearing the ducal seal, was the signature. A bold, angular script, sharp and decisive. Vance, Duke of Stonehaven. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen that hand before. A jolt, cold and electric, shot through her. She scrambled to the small chest where they kept their important papers and pulled out the deed to the cottage, the one Alec had signed in front of the priest. She laid it beside the tax decree. Her vision blurred. The signature was identical. The same sharp V. The same severe, slashing cross on the C. Alec, Vance, Mason, Duke. The words swirled into a meaningless, horrifying vortex. He was not the man who had saved her from the Duke. He was the Duke. He was the architect of her family's ruin, the cause of her every fear, the source of her village's pain. The floor seemed to drop away from beneath her. Just then, the door opened. He stepped inside, a smile on his face. In his hand, he held a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched. He saw her face, the blood drained from it, the utter devastation in her eyes. His gaze followed hers down to the 2 documents on the table. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of stark, soul-crushing dread. The lie was over. "Alara," he began, his voice a choked, ragged thing. The carved bird slipped from his numb fingers, striking the floorboards with a small, final clatter. Liar, the word was not shouted. It was a whisper, colder and sharper than any blade. She backed away from him as if he were a serpent, her hand flying to her mouth. The cottage, once her haven, felt like a cage. Every memory they had made within its walls was now tainted. A cruel scene in a play where she was the only one who didn't know her part. The way he'd commanded the guards, the impossible medicine for her father, the scholarly way he spoke of stone, his conversation with the strange man in black. It all crashed down upon her, a terrible, suffocating avalanche of truth. "Let me explain," he pleaded, taking a step toward her. His limp seemed more pronounced, a physical manifestation of his broken honor. "It began as a duty. I had to see. I never meant for it to become this. I never meant to deceive you." His words were meaningless noise against the roar of betrayal in her ears. "Explain what?" she shot back, her voice trembling with a frigid fury. "Explain how you sat at my father's table, eating the bread we could barely afford because of your laws? Explain how you held me at night while knowing your signature was the reason I cried myself to sleep? You didn't just lie about your name. You lied about everything." She couldn't bear to look at him, at the face she had come to love, which was now the face of her oppressor. With a sob that was torn from the very depths of her soul, she turned and fled. She ran from the cottage, from the man she thought she knew, and back to the familiar, debt-ridden walls of the bakery. She did not look back. Alistair stood alone in the sudden, crushing silence of the cottage. The scent of bread still lingered in the air, a ghost of the life he had just lost. He was the Duke of Stonehaven again, powerful, wealthy, and utterly alone. He had sought the truth and in the process had destroyed the only truth that had ever mattered. He returned to the cold, echoing halls of his castle a changed man. The opulent tapestries and gilded furniture seemed obscene. He saw his home now through Alara's eyes, a monument to a profound and isolating disconnect from his own people. For 3 days and 3 nights he did not sleep. With Finch at his side, he worked relentlessly, poring over every ledger, every tax roll, every petition that had been sent to him and ignored. He saw, in black and white, the slow, methodical ruin he had inflicted. It was the face of a stranger staring back at him from the official documents. On the 4th day he sent a decree of his own. He summoned every villager to the square. He stood before them on the platform, not as the mysterious Duke, but as the man they knew as Alec the Mason. He wore simple clothes, and he did not hide his limp or the exhaustion etched on his face. A wave of confusion and anger rippled through the crowd. Alara was there, standing near the back, her arms crossed, her face a pale, unreadable mask. Alistair took a deep breath and began to speak. He confessed everything. His title, his deception, his unforgivable ignorance. He told them he had come to see the consequences of his rule and had instead been shown the poverty of his own soul. "I wrote laws that broke your backs," he said, his voice ringing with a raw, painful honesty. "And I did it from a distance without understanding. There is no excuse for that failure." Then he laid out his penance. He was immediately repealing the most punitive taxes. He was using his personal fortune, not the duchy's, to establish a fund for rebuilding, for interest-free loans, for a new mill. He was tying his own prosperity directly to theirs. Finally, his gaze found Alara in the crowd. His voice dropped, becoming intensely personal, though all could hear. "A wise woman, a baker's daughter, once told me she wondered what kind of man the Duke was. I have learned he was a fool. He was a coward. But he is not the man I intend to be. He looked at her, his heart exposed for all to see. I ask for nothing, not forgiveness, not acceptance. Only that you know the depth of my regret. The Duke's words left the villagers in a stunned silence. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause began, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. It was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Alistair stepped down from the platform, his duty done. He did not approach Alara. The power, he knew, had to be hers. He had taken her choice away with his lies. He would not pressure her now with his remorse. Days turned into a week. True to his word, the changes began. The Duke's gold flowed not into his own coffers, but back into the village. The air of despair began to lift, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning hope. Alistair remained at the castle, managing the work, but his heart was in the small cottage at the edge of the woods. One evening, he sat in his vast, lonely study, staring into the fire, when the heavy oak door creaked open. It was Alara. She stood on the threshold, looking small and uncertain in the cavernous room. In her hand, she held the small, carved wooden bird. She walked slowly toward him, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. She stopped before his massive desk, the physical manifestation of the power and distance that had separated them. "The Duke of Stonehaven is a fool," she said softly. He flinched, accepting the blow. "I know, but," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she placed the little bird on a stack of official papers. "Alec the Mason built a very fine wall. His hands were honest. Even if his name was not, she finally met his eyes, and he saw not the fire of her anger, but the clear, steady light of a hard-won peace. Can that man learn to be an honest duke?" He rose slowly, the weight of the last weeks heavy on him. He walked around the desk, closing the space between them until only a breath separated them. "With you," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I believe I can do anything." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, hers, still with a faint dusting of flour on the knuckles, and his, calloused from both stone and a sovereign's pen. In that touch, the Duke and the baker's daughter were gone, and only a man and a woman remained, ready to build a new life